It was upon a raw February afternoon, one of those London days when the very air seems steeped in soot and melancholy, that I returned to Baker Street to find my friend in one of those moods which, to the untrained observer, might have appeared as mere idleness, but which I had learned to recognize as the stillness that precedes a storm. The fog, of that yellow-brown hue peculiar to our city, hung low over the street lamps and drifted in sluggish coils past the windows. Within our sitting room, however, there was warmth. A coal fire glowed behind its fender. The familiar chemical odors of my companion's experiments mingled faintly with the tang of tobacco. And upon the mantelpiece stood the Persian slipper which, by some odd caprice Holmes had long employed as a receptacle for his correspondence. Sherlock Holmes lay stretched upon the sofa, his long, nervous figure in repose, the fingertips of both hands pressed together, and his eyes half closed, as though he were listening to something too subtle for human ears. Beside him, on the table, lay a scattering of objects which I took, at first glance, to be the remnants of some idle rummaging: a brass button, a length of blue twine, a folded handbill, and a small circle of wax as perfectly cut as a coin. "You are late, Watson," said he, without so much as opening his eyes. "I could scarcely be early," I answered, shaking the damp from my coat. "The streets are clogged with cabs and drays. There has been some commotion near Charing Cross." Indeed. A hansom overturned at the Strand entrance. The horse leamed. The driver drunk but not injured. The passenger, a clerk carrying legal papers, which are now soaked and will be copied at unnecessary expense. Holmes spoke in the same tone in which he might have recited the contents of a newspaper. I stared at him, vexed in spite of myself. "You have not left this room all day?" "No." "Then how can you possibly—" He opened his eyes at last and regarded me with that quiet amusement which, in my more sensitive moments, I could almost have found exasperating. "My dear fellow, I see you have been splashed with mud to the left knee, and again, more lightly, to the right shin. That is the signature of a vehicle skidding as it turns from the Strand. The smear is heavy and tarry fresh road mending near Charing Cross. Your coat sleeve has a faint crease of dried paper pulp and ink. You have wiped your hand upon it. Add the odor of cheap gin upon your cuff transferred from another man's hand in a brief, sudden contact hand, the thing becomes simplicity itself. One grows accustomed to your miracles," I murmured, though I confess that, even after long companionship, such exhibitions of his analytic power never failed to stir my admiration. Holmes' gaze drifted, as it so often did, from my face to the small details of my person, my boots, my watch chain, the knot of my tie. Then it paused. "Ha!" he said softly. It was not an exclamation of triumph, or even of surprise, rather the sound a man makes when a half-formed thought suddenly becomes complete. "What is it?" I asked. "Nothing yet." He sat up, lean and angular, and reached for his pipe. "You have, I perceive, acquired something of interest since breakfast." I acquired nothing at all. Holmes smiled in that irritating way of his, as if my statement were a naive confession. "In your right-hand coat pocket," said he, "there is an object which is both metallic and stained with a substance that is not mud." A chill, quite independent of the cold fog outside, ran along my spine. "My pocket." I echoed foolishly and put my hand to it. Holmes stopped me with a gesture. "Quick! Imperative! Do not take it out," said he. "Not yet." For one instant I had the absurd sensation that some criminal trick had been played upon me, that I had, without knowing it, been made a carrier of contraband. The thought was so grotesque that I almost laughed until I saw the expression upon Holmes' face. It had lost its languor. There was in it that bright, eager intensity which I associated with danger and the sudden opening of a trail. At that moment, there came a brisk knock at the door, and before Mrs. Hudson could answer it, The visitor had already mounted the stair with the directness of one who comes. Upon urgent business, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard entered. Hat in hand, his narrow, ferret-like face sharpened by anxiety. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, casting a quick glance at me and then fixing his eyes upon my companion. "I'm glad to find you in. We've a case, one of those cases that makes a man feel he's been born without eyes." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And therefore you have come to borrow mine." Lestrade's mouth twitched. "You can jest, sir, but it's black work. A gentleman dead in his study. No sign of robbery. Doors fastened. Windows latched. And the queerest detail, well, I'll tell it in order. Pray do." Holmes' voice had grown softer, more attentive. Lestrade took a breath as though marshalling facts against an opponent. "The dead man is Mr. Horace Willoughby. You'll know the name connected with the Willoughby and Sloane banking concern, Lombard Street. Respected, well-off, private habits. Lives alone in a house in Bloomsbury with 2 servants. This morning the housemaid brings in his tea and finds him in the study, lying on the rug before the fireplace. Cause of death." "A stab," said Lestrade, and his voice lowered involuntarily. "Straight through the heart. Done, neat, and quick. There was little blood on the carpet, which is strange enough, but what's stranger there was no weapon." Holmes' eyebrows lifted a fraction. "Removed by the murderer." "That's what we thought until we examined the room. There's no sign of struggle. The desk drawers haven't been forced. The safe's untouched. The door was locked from inside. The key was found in his pocket. The windows were latched. The servants swear no one went in or out." "A familiar paradox," murmured Holmes. "Continue." Lestrade shifted his weight, clearly impatient with metaphysics. "The only thing out of place, if you can call it that, was a small smear on the writing table, like grease or black wax, and a curious little circle of wax on the carpet, as if someone had dropped a sealing wax disc perfectly round. Mind you, like it had been punched." Holmes' eyes flicked. For the briefest instant, toward the table beside him, toward the small circle of wax I had noticed on my arrival. Then they returned to Lestrade's face. "And you have come," said Holmes, "because the Yard is at a loss." "We've got suspects," said Lestrade quickly, eager to reassert control. "A nephew, young Rupert Willoughby, who was seen near the house last night and stands to inherit. Also a clerk from the bank, one Mortimer Vane, who had quarreled with the deceased. Both have motives enough." But he spread his hands in irritation. "Motive isn't evidence, and evidence is locked up in that blasted room." Holmes nodded slowly. "When did the medical man arrive?" "Dr. Hatherley from the next street. He puts the time of death between midnight and 2 in the morning." Holmes rose. "Watson, your hat." I obeyed mechanically, still conscious of the mysterious weight in my right pocket, as though it had become suddenly heavier, charged with significance. Lestrade was halfway to the door when Holmes' voice stopped him. "One moment. Inspector." Holmes' eyes were on me now, not with amusement, but with that peculiar gentleness he could sometimes show when he knew he was about to wound a friend's pride. "Watson," said he, "have you by any chance handled a knife today?" "A knife? Certainly not." Holmes came close, so close that I could see the flecks of gray in his sharp, clear eyes. "Then," said he quietly, "you will be interested to learn that the murder weapon in Mr. Horace Willoughby's case is, at this instant, in your pocket." For a second I could not speak. I could only stand and stare at him while Lestrade uttered an exclamation and took a step forward, his hand half rising as though to seize me. "Steady," cried Holmes sharply. "No melodrama, Inspector. If Dr. Watson were capable of such an act, I should not have waited for you to come up the stairs before making my observations." "Then how?" I managed at last. "Holmes, this is absurd. "I do not protest," said he. "Let us rather examine how the absurd may be true." He turned to Lestrade. "Come, we shall go to Bloomsbury. And on the way, Inspector, you will do well to reflect that the most secure locked room in London is useless, if the key to it can be carried out in an honest man's coat." With that, he took up his coat and scarf, and with a final glance, half warning, half reassurance at me, he led the way down to the street, leaving me to follow with the sickening conviction that some unseen hand had made me, in spite of my honor, an accessory to murder, and all the while, in my right-hand pocket, the unknown object pressed against my fingers like a cold accusation. Lestrade's declaration, though made with the brusque confidence of an official man, fell upon me like a physical blow. I followed Holmes down the stair and out into the thick, reeking London air with a mind in revolt against the suggestion. More than once my hand strayed to my right-hand pocket, and each time the same hard outline met my fingers, small, cold certainty that mocked my protestations. Holmes walked a pace ahead, his head sunk between his shoulders, his long strides eating up the pavement as though the case were already laid out like a diagram before him. Lestrade kept to my other side, casting at me those quick, suspicious glances which a policeman cannot wholly restrain when an unexpected possibility presents itself. "You'll not take it amiss, Doctor," said he at last, "if I ask you to hand over whatever Mr. Holmes thinks you're carrying. Procedure is procedure." Holmes answered for me without turning. "You will take it amiss, Inspector, if you attempt to seize it in the street like a costermonger's purse. There is a right way to handle edged steel, and a wrong way. Also," he added, in that dry tone which always nettled the official mind, "there is a right way to handle Dr. Watson." I could not help a bitter laugh. "Holmes, this is monstrous. If there is anything in my pocket, it is there by accident." "By design," said he quietly. "Accident is a word invented by the unimaginative to save them the trouble of looking for causes. A four-wheeler, its lamps jaundiced in the fog, rattled us towards Bloomsbury. The wheels sent up a hiss from the wet stones, and the horse's breath smoked like a little engine. Within the cab, Lestrade produced a notebook and began to recite, as if by repetition he could force sense from confusion. The locked door, the key in the dead man's pocket, the servant's testimony, the punctured circle of wax, the greasy smear upon the writing table. Holmes listened with his eyes half shut, yet I knew he missed no syllable. Once only he leaned forward to ask the exact position of the body in relation to the hearth and desk, and once again to learn whether the fire had been banked or allowed to die. Lestrade answered, and I saw the faintest tightening at the corner of Holmes' mouth as if some invisible cog had slipped into place. At last the cab drew up before a respectable Georgian house, its brickwork darkened by age and London smoke. A constable stood at the steps and another at the side passage, their silhouettes blurred by the fog. Within, the air was close with coal and furniture polish, and a frightened housemaid hovered in the passage, her apron clutched to her mouth. Lestrade led us without delay to the study at the rear. It was a sober, well-appointed room, shelves of ledgers and law books, a heavy mahogany desk, a carpet of deep pile, and a broad fireplace with a small fire still smoldering under ash. Upon the rug lay the body of Horace Willoughby, a gray-haired man with a well-fed face, now drained of color. His head had fallen sideways, his right hand half closed, as though he had meant to grasp at something. His waistcoat was stained dark where the blade had entered, and yet, as Lestrade had said, there was remarkably little blood elsewhere. Holmes did not at once approach the corpse. He stood in the doorway, his eyes traveling over the room as a musician's might over the keys before a performance. Then he moved swiftly, noiselessly here to the window latch, there to the skirting board, then to the hearth. He crouched, sniffed, and with the tip of his finger drew a faint line across the mantel. examining what came away upon the skin. "Coal dust," he murmured, and his gaze shot to the grate. Lestrade's impatience broke out. "It's locked, Mr. Holmes. The door was locked, the windows were locked." "We've been through all that." "Yes," said Holmes. "And you have therefore concluded that the murder was committed by a phantom or by the deceased himself. Both are popular solutions. Neither is commonly correct." He turned suddenly to me. "Watson." I stepped forward, my throat dry. "Yes." "Stand by the desk," said he, "and very carefully take out what is in your right-hand pocket. Place it upon the blotter. Do not touch the point." Lestrade's eyes glittered. The constable at the door craned his neck. My fingers fumbled with the pocket flap. For one dreadful moment I feared I should draw forth some grotesque implement which would stamp me, in every mind present, with guilt. Then the object slid into my palm, a small knife no longer than my hand, with a narrow, stiff blade and a dark wooden handle. It was the sort of knife a man might use to open parcels or sharpen a quill. The steel, however, was smeared near the hilt with a brownish stain that needed no expert to name. I set it down as Holmes directed. Lestrade gave a sharp exclamation. "There, what did I tell you?" Holmes' hand came down like a clamp upon the inspector's wrist as it moved towards the knife. "Not so fast," said he. "Look, do not merely see." Ah! He took a lens from his pocket and bent over the blade. For a full half-minute there was only the crackle of the dying fire and the distant rumble of street traffic. Then Holmes straightened, and his eyes, those cold, bright eyes, met mine with an expression I could not read. "This knife," said he, "has been wiped poorly. Whoever wiped it used paper of a fibrous, cheap kind. There are still threads upon the metal." Lestrade snorted. "So he wiped it with paper. What of that?" Holmes pointed with the knife held delicately between finger and thumb towards the desk. "What of that?" "Why, Inspector, that desk contains, I observe, a freshly used pad of the cheapest office paper, its corner torn away. Here is the torn edge. Here," he held the knife closer, "are the fibers." He replaced the knife upon the blotter as though it were a venomous thing. "Now, Watson, tell me, when did you last use that pocket?" I stared at him. The question was so ordinary, so domestic, that it cut through the horror with a strange sharpness. "This morning," I said slowly, "at the surgery. I took out my handkerchief, nothing more." Holmes nodded, as if that were precisely what he expected. "Then the knife was placed there after you left." Lestrade's face had changed. Suspicion gave way to bewilderment. "Placed there by whom?" Holmes' gaze traveled to the dead man, then to the fireplace, and finally to the small, perfectly cut circle of wax upon the carpet which Lestrade had described. "By the murderer," said he, "who has contrived not merely to kill Mr. Willoughby in a locked room, but to export the proof of the killing in the pocket of my friend, confident that Scotland Yard would do the rest." Holmes' words, spoken with that quiet conviction which made them more formidable than any outburst, seemed to chill even Lestrade's bustling energy. The inspector bent once more over the knife upon the blotter, as if the thing might change its nature beneath his stare. And then he straightened with an effort. "You mean," said he slowly, "that the murderer not only killed the man, but planted the weapon on the doctor to throw us off." "I mean precisely that," returned Holmes. "And I mean also that he counted upon the Yard's habit of fastening upon the nearest convenient explanation, and calling it proof." I could not refrain from an indignant protest. "Holmes, this is intolerable. How could any man have put it into my pocket without my knowledge?" Holmes' eyes never left the room. In a crowd, in a doorway, in a moment of jostling at a crossing. You yourself spoke of commotion near Charing Cross. There are men in London whose fingers are as delicate as a lady's and as quick as a striking snake. It is their trade to lighten pockets, but it can serve darker purposes than theft. Lestrade's face flushed. Then we're to hunt pickpockets, now are we? While a banker lies dead in his own study. While a banker lies dead, said Holmes, we must hunt the mind that arranged all this. The hand is secondary. He moved at last to the body and knelt with an absence of ceremony which would have shocked a drawing-room, but which I had seen too often to remark. He examined the wound with the precise attention of a surgeon, his fingers lifting the cloth only as far as was needed. I, who had some professional knowledge, watched with a kind of grim fascination. The puncture was clean. The blade had entered between the ribs with a sure thrust. Yet there was something odd about it, something that made my mind stumble and then recoil. You observe, Watson? Said Holmes, without looking up. The direction is straight, I answered. A right-handed man standing close. The blow was delivered with force. Death would have been instantaneous. Quite. And yet there is little external bleeding. Why? I hesitated. If the blade remained for some moments plugging the wounds, then the blood would not escape freely until it was withdrawn. Holmes' thin lips curved. And the murderer removed the blade afterwards, wiped it, and at leisure placed it in your pocket. That is one possibility. Another is that the blade was never withdrawn by the murderer at all. Lestrade stared. Never withdrawn. Then where is it? Holmes rose and dusted his knees. He walked to the fireplace, took the tongs, and with a practiced motion stirred the ash and half-burnt coal. A faint metallic sound answered him. He paused, listening. Then, with the tongs, he drew forth a small object and set it upon the hearthsto. It was not a knife, but it might once have been part of one, a narrow strip of steel. Blackened and warped, the end jagged as though snapped. Even in its ruined state, it held a sinister significance. Lestrade uttered an oath under his breath. The point? I cried. The point of the blade. Precisely, said Holmes. The murderer broke it off in the wound, intentionally or otherwise, and then sought to conceal that fact by removing the remainder. But you see the difficulty, Inspector? A blade does not commonly break in such a fashion unless something is wrong with the steel ore, unless the blow was struck against resistance. Resistance? Lestrade echoed. Holmes' glance went to the rug. The body lay here. The hearth there. The blow was struck, and yet the point is in the fire. Someone stood by that fireplace after the killing, close enough to drop the fragment into the coals. Why? Because he did not dare carry it away. Because he feared, perhaps, that it might be found upon him. Therefore, he destroyed it. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. Or he used the fire as part of the trick. You're saying he broke it on purpose? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he crossed to the desk, his fingers hovering over the surface without touching. This smear you spoke of black wax. It is not grease. It is sealing wax, softened by heat and pressed down. He opened a drawer with the tip of his finger and drew out a stick of sealing wax. It was an ordinary thing, the sort any man might keep for letters. Holmes held it close to the fire, and the end softened, giving off that faint resinous scent which brought to my mind old correspondence and quiet evenings. With the softened wax, he touched the desk lightly, lifted it, and then pressed it to a scrap of paper. When he pulled away, a thin skin of wax clung and tore. A seal was made here, said he, but not a seal upon a letter. A seal upon something else, something that was pressed, lifted, and removed. Lestrade's brows drew together. You talk in riddles. I talk in facts, said Holmes coldly. It is your habit to convert them into riddles by refusing to see their relation. He turned suddenly upon me. Watson, when you arrived at Baker Street today, what did you do first? I hung up my coat, I said, washed my hands, sat down. You were on the sofa. And did you at any time leave your coat unattended in the hall? Only for a moment, while Mrs. Hudson spoke to me. But Holmes, surely you do not suspect I suspect nothing, said he. I infer. Your coat was accessible for perhaps 30 seconds. Enough for a practiced hand to insert a knife and depart. But that tells us only how the thing might be done. It does not tell us who did it, nor why he chose you as his carrier. Lestrade broke in, the practical man clinging to practical points. We've still got the nephew and the clerk. One of them could have done it. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Indeed, and one of them has taken pains that you should think so. Tell me, Inspector, did either suspect know that Dr. Watson is my associate and would likely be consulted? Lestrade blinked. Half London knows it. Just so, said Holmes. Then by planting the weapon on Watson, the murderer does three things at once. He casts a shadow upon my friend. He draws my attention urgently to the case, and he ensures that Scotland Yard will blunder noisily in the wrong direction. I felt my anger give way to a dull apprehension. Then I have been used as bait. As a message, Holmes corrected gently. A message written in steel. He paced once, twice, the room narrowing around his thoughts. We must examine your morning, Watson, every step. The surgery, the street, the crowd near Charing Cross. We must also examine Willoughby's recent correspondence. And we must speak with the servants again separately. A locked room is rarely locked to those who understand its lock. Lestrade drew himself up. Are you taking over, Mr. Holmes? Holmes looked at him with weary amusement. No, Inspector. I am only doing what you came to Baker Street to beg me to do. He slipped on his gloves and nodded towards the door. Come, Watson. We go first to your surgery. The murderer's hand has brushed your coat. Somewhere it has brushed something else. And when we find that something, this clever little drama of his will end, not with applause, but with handcuffs, we emerged once more into the thickened afternoon. And if the fog had seemed oppressive in Baker Street, it was doubly so in Bloomsbury, where the air lay stale between the tall fronts and the square's bare trees, rose like black scribbles against a jaundiced sky. Holmes beckoned to a passing hansom and named my surgery in Paddington with that air of decision which admits no argument. Lestrade would have followed, but Holmes checked him with a slight motion of the hand. Not yet, said he. You will return to the yard, Inspector, and keep your nephew and your clerk within reach. Above all, you will do nothing in public which suggests that we have found anything in my friend's pocket. If you cannot restrain yourself from idiocy, at least practice it in private. Lestrade's lips tightened, but he swallowed the retort. And if I refuse to be ordered about? Holmes' smile was thin. Then you may enjoy the satisfaction of arresting the wrong man with perfect regularity, while the right one congratulates himself. Good day. So it was that Watson and Holmes, doctor and detective, one still smarting under a most humiliating rail, were carried westward through the murk. I watched the blur of shops and passers-by as if any face might suddenly detach itself from the stream and declare, by a flicker of recognition, that it had brushed me at Charing Cross. Holmes sat opposite, very still, the light from the cab lamp tracing the aquiline line of his profile. His mind was at work. I could feel it as one feels the vibration of a machine behind a wall. You are angry, said he presently. I am, I answered bluntly, and uneasy. That knife was in my pocket, Holmes. If the Yard had taken me on the spot, if some meddling journalist had seen it, my name would have been dragged through every public house in London. Holmes' gray eyes softened, and for a moment the arrogance dropped away, leaving only the rare sincerity I prized most in him. I am sorry, Watson. Not for the danger you have faced, worse, but for the indignity. It was meant for you. That is the point. The man who planned this is not merely a murderer. He is a strategist. A strategist who knows you, I said. Or one who knows my habits, Holmes returned. There are several in London who would gamble that if a message were pinned to you, I should read it. The cab drew up at last before my modest establishment. The familiar brass plate and the frosted glass, usually a comfort to me after the day's labor, took on a strange new aspect, as if my very livelihood had been made part of another man's game. Inside, the waiting room was empty, but I heard the clink of glass from the dispensary and the subdued tread of my assistant. Young Stamford on, earnest fellow with ink-stained cuffs, looked up in surprise as we entered. "Dr. Watson, I thought you were gone for the day." "I was," said I. "Stamford, has anything unusual occurred? Any patient with rough manners? Any commotion?" He hesitated. "There was a man well dressed, but with a coarse voice, who called and asked after you. Said he had come from the hospital with a note, but he would not leave it when I told him you were out. He lingered in the passage a moment, as if uncertain, and then went away." Holmes' head lifted. "Describe him." Stamford glanced at me, puzzled, then at Holmes. Tall, dark mustache, a little scar by the left ear. He smelt of some strong pomade. "And beg pardon, sir, he walked with a slight stiffness in one leg." "A stick?" asked Holmes. "No, sir." Holmes nodded as if he had expected precisely that answer. "Thank you." I felt my irritation flare anew. "You see, Holmes, a stranger comes to my very door, asks for me, lingers in my passage, and my assistant lets him go like any common caller." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Your assistant did exactly what a sensible man does when confronted by a bully with a lie. He refused the note and did not provoke him. You, Watson, are the one who wishes to wrestle with shadows." He moved into the passage, his gaze dropping instantly to the floorboards. The umbrella stand, the peg where my coat had hung. He knelt calmly, as if in his own quarters, and with the tip of his finger traced the grain of the wood. "Someone stood here," said he. "Boots with a narrow heel. The left foot pressed more deeply than the right, sure, stiff-legged man. A smear of coal dust at the edge, he has been near a fire recently. And a faint spot of wax on the skirting." "Wax?" I cried. "Like the wax in Willoughby's study." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Like it, indeed. Your visitor is not random. He is a courier, or the principal himself. He came here for one purpose, to confirm that the weapon had been delivered, and to ensure that you would carry it onward into my sitting room." I stared at the innocent corridor of my own practice, and it seemed suddenly sinister, like a stage after the actors have gone. "But why?" I demanded. "Why not plant it directly upon some suspect? Why take the risk of involving me?" "Because," said Holmes, rising, "a planted weapon upon a suspect is evidence. A planted weapon upon Dr. Watson is theater. It is meant to draw an audience, meant to suggest that the murderer is bold enough to mock us." He stepped into the dispensary and examined, with that swift comprehensiveness of his, the shelves, the bottles, the mortar. He paused at the wastebasket and with a pair of forceps lifted something out, nothing more. At first glance, then a crumpled scrap of paper. He smoothed it upon the table. It was the torn corner of cheap writing paper, stained with a faint brown smear. Holmes held it up to the light. "Paper fibers," said he softly. "The same sort that clung to the knife." My pulse quickened. "Then the wiping was done here." "Or," Holmes corrected, "the paper came from here. Observe the edge torn, not cut. And look, there is a trace of powdered charcoal. Not from your surgery. From a fireplace. Our visitor has used your basket as a convenient place to rid himself of a fragment." I could no longer doubt that my practice had been entered as part of the plot. My thoughts flew back to the moment Stamford spoke of the stranger lingering, uncertain, in the passage. Had my coat been hanging there? Had his fingers, with practiced ease, slid the knife into the pocket while Stamford fetched some ledger or turned his back? The very idea made my skin crawl. Holmes folded the scrap carefully and placed it in his pocketbook. "Now," said he, with a sudden briskness, "we go back to Bloomsbury, to the dead man's house, to the living man's world," said Holmes. "A banker's study is a stage 2, Watson. Someone arranged props, the wax, the broken blade, the locked door. But the motive will not be found upon the rug. It will be found in Willoughby's papers, his correspondence, his enemies, and his secrets." He paused at the threshold and looked back, as if fixing the scene in his mind. "Your visitor with the stiff leg has left us a courtesy and introduction. We must now return the call." And so, with my honor still under a cloud and my nerves drawn tight as violin strings, I followed Holmes once more into the fog, feeling for the first time that the murderer's true weapon was not the knife at all, but the invisible hand which could reach into a man's life, rearrange it, and leave him helplessly watching the ruin. Holmes took me back to Bloomsbury by a route which, to my mind, was unnecessarily circuitous, but which I soon perceived had its own purpose. We traversed busier streets where a man might be lost in the moving fog of humanity, then slipped suddenly into quieter squares where every footstep rang, and every passer-by became a possible observation. My companion's head was bent, his eyes alert, and more than once he paused to glance at a window pane or the corner of a wall with the air of one who reads invisible print. "You are looking for him," I said at last. "I am looking for what he cannot help but leave behind," Holmes replied. "A stiff leg is not merely a feature. It is a rhythm. A rhythm becomes a trace." We reached Willoughby's house as dusk began to settle, turning the fog from yellow to leaden gray. The constables still kept their posts, and the servants' faces were pinched with that mingled fear and indignation which overtakes decent folk when crime violates their routine. Lestrade was not yet returned. So Holmes assumed the command of the little household with a quiet authority which none thought to dispute. "Mrs. Allen," said he to the housekeeper, a spare woman with reddened eyes, "you will oblige me by bringing me every scrap of paper which Mr. Willoughby received in the last week letters. Notes, circulars, even the wrappings. I do not care if you think it trivial. Trivialities are often the hinges upon which great doors turn." She hesitated. "Sir," the inspector said. "I am not the inspector," said Holmes gently, "and therefore I am more likely to find what he has overlooked." While she bustled away, Holmes drew me aside to the hall. "Now, Watson, we shall make a small experiment. You have the advantage of being yourself." I stared. I have seldom felt it today. Holmes' mouth twitched. "Precisely. Walk as you normally walk, from that door to the study and back again. Do not think about it." I did so, acutely conscious of my own limbs, and returned to find Holmes crouched near the baseboard with his lens. "Good," said he. "Now walk again quickly, as if summoned." I obeyed once more. Holmes compared the impressions upon the runner with a concentration which made me feel like a specimen in a museum. "You see," he said, rising, "your step is firm and even. No drag, no emphasis. Now, somewhere in this house there is another set of marks, one heel, deeper than its fellow, one toe that scuffs. They will lead, like a sentence, to the punctuation." "You mean to the study?" I murmured. "Or from it," said Holmes. We entered the study. The room had been tidied in that superficial manner by which the police, after their first rough examination, persuade themselves that order equals understanding. Yet the dead man still lay upstairs, and the very air seemed aware that something violent had occurred within these walls. The fire had been rebuilt and burned low. The desk was cleared, save for a blotter, an inkstand, and a stack of ledgers. Holmes went first to the carpet where the circle of wax had been found. He did not touch it. He merely studied the fibers around it, then shifted his gaze to the fender and the hearth. With the tongs, he drew out the ashpan, set it upon a sheet of newspaper, and with meticulous patience sifted through its contents. Presently his fingers paused. "A second fragment," said he. He held up a thin twist of metal, no longer than a thumbnail, blackened but unmistakably steel. Its edge had a peculiar serration. "From the knife?" I asked. "Not from the blade," Holmes answered. "From the spring, perhaps from the locking mechanism." This was not a common penknife. It was one with a catch. He laid it down, then crossed to the desk and, to my surprise, examined not the top but the underside. He ran his hand along the edge, paused, and then produced from a shallow groove a tiny bead of hardened wax. "Black as pitch." "Sealing wax again," said I. Holmes nodded. "Someone has used wax not as a seal, but as a temporary adhesive, something to hold, something to conceal, something to remove without leaving a nail hole." At that instant there came a sound behind us, and a man was shown in, tall, pale, and very young, dressed with an effort at fashionable negligence. His eyes went first to Holmes, then to me, then darted to the desk as if drawn there against his will. "Mr. Rupert Willoughby," said Holmes. "I am Rupert," the young man answered stiffly. "And you are?" "Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "You have heard of me." The nephew's jaw tightened. "I have. So the Yard has dragged you in." "They will make a circus of my uncle's death." "They will, if permitted," said Holmes. "Your uncle's habits were private." "Yet you were seen near this house last night." Rupert colored. "I came to see him. I was refused. He would not receive me." "By whom?" "By Mrs. Allen. She said he was engaged and would see no one. I waited, I argued, and then I left." Holmes' eyes were mild. "At what hour?" "After 11, and you quarreled with him recently?" Rupert's hands clenched. He was a hard man. He delighted in punishing those who displeased him. "Yes, we quarreled." "Is that murder?" "It is motive," said Holmes. "Motive is the seed. But we must see if there is soil and water enough for it to grow." Rupert flung a glance at me. "And who is this?" "My friend and colleague, Dr. Watson," said Holmes. The nephew stared, and I saw, just for a heartbeat, an expression pass across his face, something like relief. Swiftly masked. "You work with him," Rupert said. "I do." Rupert swallowed. "Then perhaps you will tell your friend that my uncle had enemies beyond his own blood. Men he ruined. Men he dismissed. Men who sent him letters, vile letters." Holmes' head lifted at that. "Letters." Rupert hesitated as if regretting his own words. "Yes, threats. He showed one to me last week, laughed at it. It was sealed with black wax." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Black wax, again wax, that had turned up like a recurring word in a coded message. "Can you recall the wording?" Holmes asked. Rupert shook his head. "Not precisely. Only that it spoke of accounts to be settled and a debt in blood. It was melodramatic nonsense." "Melodrama," Holmes murmured, "is often employed by those who wish their sincerity to be doubted." Mrs. Allen returned at that moment with a small tray piled with correspondence tied in a ribbon. Holmes took it as reverently as a priest might take a relic. He loosened the knot and began to sort with swift fingers. Circulars, invitations, bank notices. Then his hand stopped. An envelope, thick and creamy, addressed in a bold hand. The seal upon its flap was not red, but black. Holmes held it up to the light, and for an instant the lamp gleamed upon the wax like a dark coin. "Ah," said he softly. "Here is our hinge." Rupert leaned forward despite himself. "That is not the one I saw." "No," said Holmes, "which is why it is more interesting." He slipped a thin blade beneath the flap with infinite care. The letter within was a single sheet. Holmes read it once, his face expressionless. Then read it again, and I saw the faint tightening of his eyelids which, with him, was the equivalent of a man's exclamation. He folded it and placed it in his pocketbook without comment. "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes looked at me, and his voice, when it came, was low and very controlled. "It says, Watson, that our murderer is impatient. And it says, more importantly, that he believes I have already taken the bait." Holmes' last remark preyed upon my mind as we stood in the lamplit study with Rupert Willoughby watching us in a strained silence. The black-sealed letter, now folded away in my companion's pocketbook, had altered something in his manner. His laziness had fallen from him like a discarded cloak. He moved with that swift precision which I had come to associate with moments when the scattered pieces within his brain had begun to form a coherent design. "You will pardon me, Mr. Willoughby," said Holmes, "if I ask you to perform a small service for me. You have been candid so far. Continue to be so, and you may yet save yourself trouble." Rupert's nostrils flared. "I have nothing to hide." "Excellent," said Holmes. "Then you will have no objection to telling me without embroidery what business brought you here last night, after 11 o'clock. The young man shifted, his hands working together. "I came for money," he burst out. "There, since you must have it. He had promised years ago, when my father died, that he would see me set up properly. But he held the purse strings like a miser. He enjoyed it. He would let a man beg before he'd throw him a shilling." Holmes inclined his head. "And you begged?" Rupert's face reddened with shame. "Yes, I begged. I said I would go abroad if he would only advance what he had promised. He refused." He laughed. "And you left?" said Holmes. "I left," Rupert repeated quickly, as if the word could exorcise the suspicion in the air. "Ask the constable at the corner." I walked away. I went to my rooms in Jermyn Street. I was there by midnight. Holmes' eyes flicked to Mrs. Allen. Did Mr. Willoughby receive any visitor after his nephew departed? The housekeeper wrung her hands. "No, sir." Mr. Horace was strict. If he said no visitors, he meant it. "We heard nothing in the night." "Nothing but," she hesitated, her eyes darting to the hearth, "but the sound of the fire settling, perhaps." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "You heard the fire. It is close to the stairs, sir. Yet you heard no cry," said Holmes softly. "No footstep, no fall, no struggle. Only the fire. That is remarkable." Rupert gave a short, harsh laugh. "My uncle would not cry out. He would die as he lived, silent, stubborn, and alone." Holmes turned away as if the conversation had exhausted its usefulness. He began to examine the room anew, but now with a different intent. He was no longer gathering general impressions. He was searching for a particular thread in the tapestry. "Watson," said he, "stand by the door and observe the threshold. Do you see any mark there which would not be made by the household?" I knelt, feeling absurdly like a schoolboy set a task. The brass strip was scuffed, as any threshold is. But near its center, my eye caught a faint line like a scrape made by metal. "A scratch," I said. Holmes nodded. "A scratch which runs inward, not outward." Something hard and narrow was dragged across it into the room. Not a boot. "Something lower, a knife," I suggested, thinking of the broken point. "Not dragged," said Holmes. "Carried. But something else was dragged." He stepped to the hearth and, with a rapid glance around, lifted the fender slightly. From beneath it he drew a small object wrapped in gray paper. He held it up, and the room seemed to tighten about us. "It is not mine," said Mrs. Allen at once, frightened. Rupert stared. "What is it?" Holmes unwrapped the paper. Within lay a little brass cylinder no longer than a man's thumb, with a narrow slit at one end and a faint spiral groove along its body. It looked, to my untrained eye, like a piece of some mechanism. Holmes' nostrils flared as he sniffed it. "Oil," said he, "and beeswax. A curious combination. Inspector Lestrade would call it rubbish and have it swept away." "What is it, then?" I asked. "A part," said Holmes, "of a device. A device intended to accomplish one thing: to introduce and withdraw something through a narrow opening." With delicacy and without noise, Rupert's voice rose. "You mean some sort of burglar's tool?" Holmes regarded him coolly. "I mean a tool used by a man who does not wish to be discovered entering a room. A man who prefers to make the room itself do his work for him." He moved to the writing table and traced the black smear which Lestrade had mentioned. Under the lamplight it had a dull sheen. Holmes took a thin slip of paper, touched the smear, and lifted it. A faint thread of wax drew up and snapped. "Adhesive?" he murmured. "Temporary. Strong enough for a moment, weak enough to remove." He looked suddenly at the ceiling above the desk and then at the heavy curtains by the window. "Mrs. Allen who draws those curtains at night?" "The housemaid, sir. And are they tied back?" Holmes' eyes remained fixed upon the thick cord with its tasseled end. "They are tied, sir, yes." Holmes crossed to them and examined the cord. His fingers moved to the tassel, and he plucked at it lightly. Something within shifted with a faint, dry click so slight that only my companion's strained attention could have caught it. Holmes' expression did not change, but I saw the quick gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "Watson," said he, very quietly, "our man has been here with his fingers upon this cord." I stared at the innocent ornament. "How can you tell?" Holmes held the tassel to the light. "The silk has been retwisted. The knot has been undone and retied by a hand that does not belong to the maid. And there is a faint smear wax, again where someone held a small object against it." Rupert's face had gone pale. "Are you saying the murderer hid in the curtains?" Holmes shook his head. "No. If he had, he would have needed to leave, and we should be hunting a man with dust on his coat and soot on his shoes. Our murderer is cleaner than that. He did not hide himself. He hid his method." A step sounded in the hall, brisk and heavy, and Lestrade came in with an air of one who has been denied sleep and refuses to admit it. He stopped short at the sight of Rupert. "So you've turned up again, have you?" he growled. Holmes raised a hand. "Later, Inspector. For the moment, you will listen. I have found something you would have missed." Lestrade's eyes went to the brass cylinder. "What's that?" "More of your tricks?" Holmes' voice sharpened. "Not tricks mechanics. Tell me, Inspector, is there a ventilator in this room? A grate in the wall? A speaking tube? Anything which opens to the passage or to the exterior?" Lestrade frowned and pointed. "There's a small ventilator by the skirting, near the desk. For air, old houses have them." Holmes' eyes flashed. "Exactly. And it is just large enough, if one had the proper device to admit a narrow blade." Lestrade stared. "You can't mean I mean that the locked room problem is no problem at all," said Holmes. The door was locked. The window latched. The murderer never used either. He used the house's own throat, the ventilator, and a mechanism concealed, for a time, by wax. He struck from outside the room, or at least without entering it in the ordinary way. I felt a coldness creep over me. The idea of a hidden blade sliding through an unseen opening, seeking a man's heart while he sat unsuspecting by his own fire, was monstrous in its ingenuity. "And the knife in my pocket?" I asked. Holmes turned to me, and now there was an edge in his tone, a flourish, a diversion. "The murder was done by a blade which could be introduced and withdrawn. The planted knife was intended to make us forget the possibility of another weapon entirely and to soil your name as an additional pleasure." Lestrade's skepticism fought with the facts before him. "Then how was the blade broken? How did the point end up in the fire?" Holmes' gaze drifted to the rug where Willoughby had fallen. "Because the victim was not wholly passive. He moved, perhaps he rose, perhaps he stumbled back, perhaps he seized at the instrument through the grate. There was a struggle of inches, not yards, and that was enough to snap inferior steel. The murderer, unable to retrieve the point without exposing himself, relied upon the fire to destroy it. He counted on your men to stir the ashes carelessly and scatter it to nothing. He stepped closer to Lestrade. "Now, Inspector, I require two things from you. First, the exact measurements of that ventilator. And second, the list of every man in London who has recently purchased or commissioned a small mechanical contrivance involving brass, oil, beeswax, and a spring." Lestrade gave a snort. That list would be half the city. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Then we shall reduce half the city to one man by finding who has a stiff leg, who can write a bold hand, and who seals his threats with black wax for the first time." I saw fear in Rupert Willoughby's face, not fear for himself, but fear of the invisible adversary who had reached into his uncle's house and killed him without crossing the threshold. And as Holmes replaced the brass cylinder in its paper wrapping with the care of a man handling a loaded pistol, I understood that the case had passed from mere murder into something colder, an encounter of minds, where the murderer's pride might yet drive him to a second stroke. Holmes' request, flung at Lestrade with that air of turning impossibilities into errands, had the effect of sending the inspector into a dogged silence. He stooped, measured the ventilator with a scrap of paper and the stub of a pencil, and muttered figures to himself while his men prized off the small iron grill. 2 inches and a quarter by 7, he announced grudgingly, "and it opens to the passage between this room and the back stairs." Holmes took the grill, examined the screws, and smiled faintly. "Removed and replaced more than once," said he. "The slots are bruised. Someone has used a tool in haste and then tried to repair his clumsiness." Lestrade bristled. "We'll post a man in the passage. If your phantom comes back, he will not come back that way now," Holmes interrupted. "The moment he learns the grill has been disturbed, he will know that I have read his method. What we require is not a constable with a truncheon, but a net with patience." Rupert Willoughby, who had remained like a pale statue beside the bookcase, found his voice at last. "If you know how it was done, Mr. Holmes, then you must know who did it." Holmes' gaze rested on him, and I saw again that curious combination of detachment and pity, which could make him seem inhuman one instant and profoundly humane the next. "No, Mr. Willoughby, knowing a method is like knowing the key to a cipher. It tells you there is sense beneath the symbols. It does not give you the message." Lestrade's impatience boiled over. "Then where do we go from here? I've a dead banker, a nephew with motive, a clerk with a grudge. And now you tell me it was done with some infernal fishing rod through a vent?" "A rod," said Holmes softly, "which required brass, oil, beeswax, and a spring. Those are not poetic elements, Inspector. They are the receipts of a tradesman." He turned to Mrs. Allen. "Your master employed a manservant?" "No, sir." "Only myself and the housemaid, and cook. And who repairs the house? Who tends the grates, the vents, the locks?" Holmes' voice was mild, but his eyes were fixed upon her as if they could force memory from reluctance. "The odd jobbing," she said. "A Mr. Pike, sir, from the Mews. He comes when anything is wrong." Holmes' head inclined. "And when was he last here?" Mrs. Allen frowned, counting days upon her fingers. "Monday, I believe." The ventilator rattled. Mr. Horace disliked noise. Mr. Pike tightened it. Holmes' eyes flicked to the bruised screwheads. "Or loosened it," said he. Lestrade gave a short laugh. "So now we arrest the handyman." Holmes' tone hardened. "No, we speak with him. We speak with the bank clerk. We speak with the nephew. And while we do so, we look for the one detail which cannot be forged habit." He moved to the desk, opened a ledger, and ran his finger down a page with the ease of a man accustomed to interpreting figures as readily as footprints. Willoughby was a banker. He dealt in debts. A threat speaking of accounts to be settled is not random rhetoric. It is a man choosing a language that will sting his victim. The murderer wishes to be read as an injured creditor. But is he? Rupert's voice shook. My uncle had ruined men. Perhaps, said Holmes, or perhaps he merely refused them what they believed the world owed them. Lestrade leaned nearer. That black-sealed letter you pocketed, what's in it? Holmes did not answer at once. He took it out, held it above the lamp, and studied the paper as if the words were secondary. The hand is bold, said he, but the pressure is uneven. The writer has pain in one leg, yes, but also a stiffness in the finger's old injury. Perhaps, or rheumatism. He blots carelessly because he cannot wait. He is not writing to communicate. He is writing to perform. He unfolded the letter at last and read, not the whole, but a portion, in a voice as flat as a judge's. You have taken it. As I knew you would, you will look where I have told you to look, and you will find what I have left for you, yet you will not find me until I permit it. Tell your friend, the doctor, that his pocket is not sulfur monoxide private as he believes. Holmes refolded it. I felt my cheeks burn, not from fear now, but from a kind of cold rage at the intimacy of the insult. Lestrade swore under his breath. Rupert stared as though the very walls had spoken. A taunt, said Lestrade. That's what it is. It is bait, Holmes corrected. And bait is only set where there is a hook. He walked to the window, drew back the curtain, and peered into the fog-choked square. Watson, the man with the stiff leg, did not merely place a knife in your pocket. He visited your surgery to confirm the delivery. That means he had time and he had nerve. He is not a mere mechanic, nor a common thief. He is someone who moves between classes without drawing attention. A man who can enter a respectable passage and speak to your assistant like a gentleman, and yet has the fingers of a pickpocket. A discharged clerk, I suggested. Remembering Mortimer Vane, Holmes' eyes remained on the square. Possibly. Or a man who employs such a clerk. We must beware of hunting only the hand that holds the tool. Often the mind that designs the tool never touches it. Lestrade squared his shoulders. I'll bring in Pike, then, and Vane, and the nephew if you like. Holmes turned from the window with sudden decision. You will bring none of them yet. You will do something far more useful. You will arrange for Mr. Rupert Willoughby to remain in your sight, but not in a cell. You will make him think you are satisfied with him. Let him go back to Jermyn Street, and let it be known quietly that he has been questioned and released. Rupert's eyes widened. You want me as bait? Holmes' tone softened, almost kindly. I want you alive, Mr. Willoughby, which is why you will do exactly as I say. The murderer believes you are the obvious suspect. He also believes that you are desperate for money. If he can frighten you into some foolish flight, bribery, a confession to something else, he will have tightened his net around you and distracted us again. And what of Watson? Lestrade demanded. Is he to go about with his pockets full of murder weapons? Holmes' mouth tightened. Watson will come with me. I confess there was comfort in that simple statement. Whatever disgrace had brushed my name, whatever unseen enemy had used my person as a courier, I knew that so long as I remained at Holmes' elbow, I was at least within the orbit of his protection. Holmes stepped close to Lestrade. One more thing, Inspector. Post a man, not in the passage by the ventilator, but in the mews. Find this Mr. Pike, learn his habits, where he drinks, where he buys his supplies, who limps among his acquaintances. And if you find black sealing wax in his pockets, do not arrest him. Follow him. Lestrade looked doubtful. And if he slips away? Holmes' smile returned, thin and bright. Then he will slip into my hands instead of yours. When we left the house, the fog had thickened, and the gas lamps stood in it like drowned moons. Holmes walked without haste now, but I could sense the pressure of his thought behind the calm, as if every street were a chessboard and every shadow a possible move. For the first time since the knife had been laid upon that blotter, I felt less like a man accused and more like a man enlisted. Yet beneath that steadier emotion ran another, darker current, the certainty that our adversary, having written his message in my pocket, would not be satisfied with ink alone. Holmes had his way of setting a scene without seeming to do so, and I observed, as we left Bloomsbury behind, that he shaped even our journey into part of the inquiry. We did not return directly to Baker Street, nor yet to the Yard, but turned instead through a succession of streets where the fog lay in folds and the gas lamps burned like small, weary suns. At times he walked close to the shop fronts, peering at the reflections as if the glass might betray a figure behind us. At other moments he crossed abruptly, pausing beneath an archway until a knot of pedestrians had passed, his eyes upon their feet rather than their faces. "You suspect we are followed," I said. "I suspect we are observed," Holmes answered. "There is a difference. A man may watch from a distance for hours, but he cannot follow in fog without leaving his own signature behind. Our adversary has left too many signatures already. He will, if he is wise, wish to see whether we have read them." We reached at length a narrow lane off the Edgware Road, where the respectable fronts gave way to a jumble of stables, small workshops, and low public houses whose windows glowed amber in the gloom. The smell of damp straw and horse sweat mixed with coal smoke and the sour temps of spilled ale. Here Holmes slackened his pace and became, in an instant, the loafer his shoulders rounded, his scarf pulled high, his hat brim lowered so that he seemed no longer the consulting detective, but a man with no better occupation than to avoid the cold. "This is your Mr. Pike's territory," I murmured. "It is the territory of men who mend what better men break," Holmes returned. If Pike tightened the ventilator, he did not do it in a drawing room. He did it for pay, and pay is spent where such men drink. We approached a public house with a sign of a painted crown and a name the King's Mason, half obscured by grime. Holmes stopped short of the door and laid a hand upon my sleeve. "Watson, you will not speak unless I ask you. Your face is known. Mine, thank heaven, is not, at least not in every gutter in London." He entered first, and I followed. The place was low-ceilinged and close, with a fire roaring in the grate and a dozen men clustered about tables, their boots steaming as they thawed. A fiddler in the corner scraped at a tune while two women laughed too loudly. Holmes drifted among them with that singular ease he possessed when he chose to be inconspicuous. He did not stare. He merely looked, and in the looking he seemed to gather more than any direct question could have yielded. At the bar, a thick-set man with iron-gray whiskers leaned upon his elbows, a tankard before him. He had the smell of oil and iron about him, and his hands broad, scarred, competent, rested with the habitual curl of one accustomed to tools. As he shifted, I saw that his left foot moved with less freedom than the right. Holmes brushed past him, as if by accident, and let his shoulder touch the man's arm. There was a muttered apology, a brief glare, and then the man's attention returned to his drink. Yet Holmes had already taken what he required. I saw his nostrils flare slightly, as if he had caught a scent pomade. He whispered as he passed me, "Cheap, strong." The same Stamford described. My pulse quickened. "Then that is Pike." "Possibly," said Holmes, "or possibly a man who wishes to be mistaken for Pike." He slid into a seat at a table where two laborers played dominoes and, without seeming to watch the bar, began to speak in the rough, careless tones of a man seeking gossip. "Any word," he said, "about old Horace up Bloomsbury way? They say he's gone stiff on his own rug." One of the laborers spat into the sawdust. "Serves him right, if you ask me. Wouldn't give a penny to a starving child." "Aye," said the other, "but it's queer, they say, locked in like a caged bird." Makes a man think twice about sitting too close to his fire. The first chuckled. Makes me think of them foreign tricksters with their knives on strings. Seen M at the fair stab a man and pull it back like fishing. Holmes' head dipped, and for an instant I knew he had taken that crude remark and pinned it like a specimen. He nodded, as if amused. A knife on a string? And that'd take a clever hand. Clever. The man snorted. Only takes brass and a bit o' spring. Old Pike could make you one blindfold. At the name, the domino player lowered his voice, glancing towards the bar. Careful, mate. Pike's got friends. Holmes smiled faintly. Friends with stiff legs. The man's eyes widened, and he half rose. Who are you? No one, said Holmes, and his tone turned lazy again. Just curious. A man gets curious when bankers start dying in their own parlors. At that moment, the whiskered man at the bar shifted and looked over his shoulder. His eyes, small and sharp, fixed upon Holmes with a sudden suspicion. He set down his tankard with a deliberation that spoke of a decision made. Holmes rose at once, too quickly. I thought, for an idle loiterer, but he turned it into a drunken sway and moved towards the door. I followed, my heart hammering. Behind us came the scrape of a chair and the heavy tread of boots. Outside, the fog swallowed the street. Holmes did not run. He walked fast, yes, but still a walk turning once into a narrower passage between two stables. The footsteps followed. Then another set joined, lighter and quicker, and I realized with a sick jolt that we were being herded. Holmes stopped suddenly beneath a dim lamp, and in the same instant his entire posture altered. The loafer vanished. The hawk remained. Now, said a voice from the fog, close and harsh. You've been asking questions you've no right to ask. Two men emerge, one the whiskered fellow from the bar. The other younger, with a flat cap pulled low. The elder's left leg was indeed stiff. He carried himself with a slight twist of the hip. His hand dipped towards his pocket, and I saw the glint of something metallic. Holmes' own hand moved like lightning. Not towards a weapon, but towards his collar, where his fingers pinched and drew out a small silver whistle. He blew one sharp, piercing, and the sound cut through the fog like a knife. Instantly there was a rush of feet from behind, a shout, and the sudden appearance of two uniformed Constables Lestrade's men, placed where Holmes had said, not by the ventilator, but by the Mews. The younger man bolted at once and vanished into the murk. The whiskered man hesitated, then made a lunge not at Holmes, but at me. As if the insult to my pocket still burned in his mind, I struck out with my fist, catching him on the jaw. He went down heavily, his stiff leg folding beneath him with an ugly angle. The constable seized him, and in the struggle his coat flew open. A small object fell and clinked upon the stones. Holmes stooped and picked it up before anyone else could see. Even in that weak lamplight I recognized the dull black of sealing wax in a little tin, and beside it a narrow brass piece, grooved and oiled. Holmes' eyes met mine. There was no triumph in them, only a grim confirmation. "Watson," said he softly, "we have not yet caught our murderer. But we have caught the man who built his instrument." Lestrade arrived in the Mews with a face like thunder and a temper to match it. But even his irritation faltered when Holmes laid the little tin of black sealing wax and the grooved brass piece upon the nearest barrel top. The constables held the whiskered man upright between them. He struggled for a moment and then sagged, as though the stiffness in his leg had spread into his courage. His eyes darted from Holmes to me and back again, calculating, pleading, defiant by turns. "Name," snapped Lestrade. "Jonas Pike," the man muttered at last. "Jonas Pike, I told you. I've done nothing." Holmes' voice was quiet. "You have done something, Mr. Pike. You have done it very well. The question is, did you do it for yourself or for another. Pike's jaw clenched. I mend grates and locks. That's my trade. You can't hang a man for having wax in his pocket. Lestrade thrust a hand forward. And brass fittings, and oil, and what's this? He snatched Pike's cap away, and a folded scrap fluttered out from the lining. Lestrade caught it and spread it open with a grunt of satisfaction. Ha! A note. Holmes took it from him with a certain impatience, as though Lestrade's fingers might smudge meaning itself. The paper was narrow, torn from some cheap pad. Upon it were a few figures and a word nothing that looked like a confession. Holmes studied it under the lamp, then held it nearer still. Sniffing the fibers as a hound might scent a trail. Not written by you, said Holmes, and the certainty in his tone made Pike flinch. You cannot form your letters so evenly with stiff fingers. Nor would you choose this paper. You use brown wrapping, not office pads. Pike licked his lips. It's only an address, which you have carried inside your cap, said Holmes. Because you feared a search of your pockets? That suggests it is important. Lestrade leaned in. What does it say? Holmes read it aloud, each syllable distinct. Museau, 14 rear, yard after midnight. Lestrade swore. That's here. It is an instruction, said Holmes, and it was given to Pike as one gives instructions to a tool. Pike's eyes flashed. Tool, is it? I'll not be spoken to like Holmes stepped so close that Pike's protest died in his throat. You were paid to loosen a ventilator grill in Bloomsbury on Monday. You were paid to fashion a small contrivance of brass and spring steel something of fair ground. Man might call a knife on a string, but which requires a cleaner mind than any fair ground possesses. You were paid to deliver black sealing wax to your employer and to keep your mouth shut. Pike spat into the fog. Prove it. Holmes' head turned fractionally, as if listening to a sound beyond hearing. Very well. We shall begin with what you cannot change. Your leg. The man stiffened. What of it? It is not the limp of injury, said Holmes. It is the limp of a man who has worn a brace, who has altered his gait to favor one side. You were described at Dr. Watson's surgery as stiff, not lame. That stiffness is recent. You have been practicing it. Pike stared. You're mad? I am exact, said Holmes. And now you will tell us who instructed you to imitate that gait, because he himself possesses it. He wished to be described, so that if you were seen, you would fit the story that he had already planted. Lestrade's eyes widened a little, for even his blunt imagination could follow that. You mean the murderer wanted us to think Pike was the man who came to the doctor's? Or, said Holmes, he wished Pike to be capable of visiting Watson's surgery in his stead, if necessity arose. Either way, Pike was fashioned into a decoy. The constables shifted their grip as Pike suddenly surged, not to escape, but as if to strike Holmes. I stepped forward instinctively, but Holmes did not retreat. He merely lifted his hand, and the constables tightened. Pike's face worked with rage, and then, very abruptly, with fear. You can't keep me, he said hoarsely. I've done nothing that'll hold. You will be held, Lestrade snarled. For assault, for suspicious possession. For Holmes cut him short. You will be held as a witness, Inspector, and you will be treated as such. Pike is not our man. He is the hammer, not the hand. Pike's eyes flicked to Holmes with a sudden, desperate calculation. If I speak, he whispered, I'm a dead man. Holmes' voice softened. And there was that rare gravity in it which came only when he spoke to the human heart rather than the puzzle. If you do not speak, someone else will die. Perhaps yourself. Perhaps someone you drink with at the King's Mason. Perhaps Dr. Watson. At the sound of my name, Pike flinched as if struck. The fog seemed to press in upon us, muting even the distant street noises. There was a long moment when the man's breath came fast and white. He ain't what you think, Pike said at last, The words dragged from him. He talks like a gentleman, pays like one. But there's something wrong in his eye. Like it enjoys making folk jump. Holmes' gaze sharpened. Name. Pike shook his head violently. I don't know it. I swear I don't. He came to me in the yard. Said he'd heard I could make a little device, quiet-like. Gave me the brass piece to copy. Told me to use beeswax, don't crack in the cold. Paid me twice what it was worth. What did he look like? Lestrade demanded. A mustache, Pike stammered. Dark, scar by the ear. And he walked stiff. Same as me now. Holmes' eyes flashed with a cold satisfaction. And you believed that limp was real? Pike swallowed. I did. Holmes turned away abruptly, as if the confession were only a stepping stone. His mind was already elsewhere. Watson, said he, the murderer is not merely clever. He is methodical. He has rehearsed his character as an actor rehearses a part. He writes notes like stage directions. He seals them with black wax, not because it is necessary, but because it is memorable. Lestrade jabbed a finger at Pike. We can take him to the yard, grill him properly. Holmes shook his head. We take him to the yard, yes, but we do not grill him. We protect him. For the first time, we possess a man who can lead us to the source, and the source will try to cut the line. And what are you going to do? I asked. Holmes' answer was swift. We obey the note. Lestrade stared. You're joking. Holmes looked at him as one might look at a slow pupil. The note says after midnight at No. 14 rear yard. It was meant for Pike. If Pike does not appear, our murderer will suspect he is compromised. If Pike appears with us hidden close, we may see who comes to collect his tool. Lestrade's expression hardened with reluctant admiration. You'll use Pike as bait. I will use the murderer's own timetable against him, Holmes returned. He believes himself the writer of the play. Tonight, Inspector, we shall let him walk on stage and then we shall bring down the curtain. We left Pike in the custody of one constable and drew Lestrade aside to settle the arrangements. A second constable was dispatched at once to fetch plain-clothes men. The mews around No. 14 was scouted, the rear yard examined for cover. The doors and drains noted with Holmes' meticulous care. All the while, the fog thickened, as if London itself conspired to conceal our adversary's approach. When at last the preparations were made, and the public houses began to spill their drinkers into the misty streets, Holmes and I withdrew to a small upper room lent by a stable boy, from whose cracked window we could observe the yard below. Holmes sat motionless in the darkness, his profile a sharp wedge against the glass. Lestrade shifted and whispered curses at the cold. I watched the faint circle of lamplight in the yard, and could not rid myself of the feeling that somewhere, unseen, a pair of eyes watched us in return. Midnight drew near. The city sounds dwindled. Even the horses below seemed to sense the tension, stamping now and then in their stalls. Holmes leaned close to my ear, his voice no more than a breath. Remember, Watson, when he comes, do not look at his face. Look at his hands. The yard below us lay like a small stage cut out of darkness. A single lamp, hooded against the fog, cast a pale circle upon wet cobbles and made the stable doors beyond it loom like black mouths. Somewhere a horse shifted and blew softly, and the sound in that tense quiet seemed as loud as a bell. Lestrade crouched beside the window with his collar turned up, his face a hard, expectant line. Holmes was nearer the glass, so still that I might have believed him carved there, his eyes fixed not on the gate, but upon the strip of shadow between two heaps of straw, where a man might stand unseen. After midnight, he whispered, and the words were not a reminder, but a TAE. The church clocks had scarcely finished their last stroke, when a faint scrape came from the passage below, the cautious, testing sound of a boot sole upon stone. Holmes' hand rose, palm outward, and we froze. A moment later, the rear gate opened a hand's breadth, and a figure slipped through sideways, closing it again with an infinitely gentle touch. The fog clung about him, blurring his outline, but the lamp caught enough to show a man of middle height, wrapped in a dark overcoat, hat pulled low. He paused within the circle of light as if to take his bearings. "Look at the hands," Holmes breathed. The man's hands were bare. He held them slightly away from his body, as though the very damp offended him. They were long-fingered and careful. The fingers flexed once, twice, in a manner that was almost fastidious. He glanced about, and even at that distance I could feel the impatience in the motion down in the yard. Jonas Pike guarded, yet made to appear alone, hobbled forward from the shadow by a stall. His face was a mask of sullen dread. He stopped just short of the lamplight, as if unwilling to step fully into it. "You're late," said the newcomer. His voice was low, but it carried cleanly in the stillness of voice trained to command without raising itself. Pike swallowed. "I come when I can. There's been police talk." The other made a small, contemptuous sound. "Police talk is for policemen. You were told to hold your nerve." Pike shifted his weight, the practiced stiffness in his leg exaggerated by fear. "I did what you asked. I did it all. But I don't like it. Not with a man dead, and dead men do not complain," said the stranger. He stepped closer, and as he moved the lamp, showed the edge of a dark mustache. When he turned his head slightly, I caught the pale line of a scar near the left ear. The sight sent a cold current through me. It was as if Stamford's words had taken flesh before my eyes. Holmes' body, beside me, tensed like a drawn bow. The stranger's right hand dipped into his pocket and came out with a small purse. He tossed it carelessly, as one tosses a crust to a dog. Pike caught it awkwardly, fumbled, then clutched it tight. "That is for the making," said the stranger. And this he produced, between thumb and forefinger, a slim object that glinted once and vanished again. "Is for the silence." Pike's eyes widened. "What's that?" "A reminder," said the other. "You have been useful. Do not become troublesome." From our window I saw Pike's face change. Fear warred with a sudden, desperate resentment. "I ain't your dog," he muttered, and the words seemed to surprise even himself. The stranger's head tilted, and though I could not see his eyes clearly, I felt their attention sharpen. "No," he said softly, "you are not my dog. You are my spade." A spade does not speak. Holmes' hand, which had been poised near his coat, moved. It was not a movement towards a weapon, but towards that silver whistle again. Yet he paused as if calculating a fraction too soon, a fraction too late. Below, Pike took one stumbling step forward. "You made me limp," he blurted, the confession bursting out in panic. "You told me to limp, to match you. Why? Why all this trickery? Why the wax in the vents, and why set the knife on the doctor?" The stranger went utterly still. In that instant, the fog seemed to thin, and the lamplight caught him squarely. I saw a face lean and pale, with fine bones, and an expression not of surprise, but of cold annoyance as if a mechanism had clicked where it should not. He spoke with controlled precision. "You have been talking." Pike's mouth worked. No, I swear." The stranger moved then with extraordinary speed. His hand shot out not to strike Pike, but to seize his lapel and drag him into the lamplight. The other hand rose, and for a moment something flashed steel, narrow and needle-like. Hands breathed Holmes, and his whistle was at his lips. I saw it clearly now. Not a common knife, but a small, spring-driven spike set into a brass handle, an ugly little instrument made for one swift thrust. The stranger's fingers held it with practiced familiarity. The wrist turned in the exact angle I had seen in the wound upon Willoughby's chest. Holmes blew. The whistle's shriek split the night. Instantly the yard erupted. A door flew open. Boots thundered. And Lestrade's plainclothes men surged from the shadows like hounds slipped from a leash. The stranger released Pike and sprang backward, not towards the gate, but towards the stable wall where the fog lay thickest. He had chosen his escape in advance. After him, roared Lestrade, and he was out of the room and down the stairs with the heavy haste of a man who fears his prey will vanish. Holmes was already moving, not to the stairs, but to the window. With one fluid motion, he thrust it up and swung himself onto the sill. Holmes, I cried, horror and admiration warring in me. You'll break your neck. He looked back once, and in that lamplight his face held the fierce joy of the chase. Then you will have leisure to write me a flattering epitaph, Watson. He dropped into the yard with a cat's grace and ran long legs, eating the distance. I clambered after him less neatly, for I am no gymnast and landed hard enough to jar my teeth. The cold air struck my lungs. The yard was chaos, men shouting, a horse rearing in its stall, Pike cowering against a barrel with the purse clenched to his chest. Through it all, I saw the stranger, a dark shape, skimming along the wall reach, a stack of crates. He vaulted them with the agility of youth, despite that stiff-legged persona, and for an instant the pretense fell away. His limp had been a costume indeed. Holmes gained upon him, but the other had one advantage. He had prepared the ground. A rope hung from a loft above, and he caught it and swung up, boots scraping wood. Holmes leaped, seized the rope a foot below, and for a moment both men were suspended in the smoky light-like figures in some grotesque lantern show. The stranger struck downward with the spring spike. Holmes twisted, and I heard the sharp crack as steel met wood, not flesh. Holmes' free hand shot out and caught the man's wrist. Their faces were inches apart, Holmes set with cold determination. The other's twisted into a smile that was almost delighted. You read the method, the stranger hissed. But you did not read the man. Holmes' voice was like ice. I am reading you now. They swung. The rope creaked. Then the stranger did something wholly unexpected. He released his own hold and dropped. He fell not to the cobbles, but onto a mound of straw, which broke his descent. Before any man could seize him, he rolled, came up running, and vanished into the fog beyond the stalls, leaving behind only the echo of that last taunting sentence. Holmes stood upon the rope for a heartbeat longer, then dropped lightly beside me. His breath came fast, but his eyes were alight. Lestrade arrived an instant later, wild with fury. Gone, he shouted. Damn him, gone. Holmes picked up, from where it had fallen near the straw, the little spring spike in its brass handle. He examined it, then slipped it into his pocket with the care of a man securing a decisive document. Not gone, said he quietly, only moved. Lestrade's hands trembled. We had him. Holmes' gaze went to the fog where the man had disappeared. No, said he. He had us long enough to show that he could escape. That was tonight's second message. But he has left me something better than his capture. I stared at him. Better. Holmes' mouth tightened. His confidence and his haste. He dropped his weapon because he was forced to choose between pride and safety. Men who make such choices make mistakes. Now we shall compel him to make another in terms of my choosing. Holmes' calm after the failure of our trap was, I confess, more disquieting to me than Lestrade's rage. The inspector stormed up and down the yard, snapping orders which his men could not obey, for there was nothing now to seize but fog and the sour smell of horse. Pike had been hurried away to safer custody, and the stable boy who had lent us his upper room stood blinking in the lamplight like a man awakened from a dream. Yet Holmes, with the little brass-handled spike secured in his pocket, moved with the same deliberate composure as though he had expected the very manner of the escape. "You speak of haste," I said, as we walked at last from the mews into the darker streets. Yet he escaped with extraordinary coolness. "He escaped," Holmes answered, "with extraordinary preparation. That is not the same thing. Observe, Watson, how he chose the straw, the rope, the crates, each placed as if by chance, yet each capable of serving him. The prepared mind does not appear hurried. It only becomes hurried at the moment when preparation fails. Lestrade, who trudged beside us in sullen defeat, flung out an arm. Preparation! Then he's done it before. We'll have every constable in London on the lookout for a man with a mustache and a scar." Holmes gave a short laugh. "And they will arrest half the mutiny." "No, Inspector. We do not seek a mustache. We seek a man who can afford to grow one to order and shave it away without regret." He led us not to Baker Street, but to a handsome rank where he engaged a cab and gave an address in a quieter tone. I caught only the word Lombard, and my thoughts leaped at once to Willoughby's bank. "You mean to go there now?" "I asked at once," said Holmes. "A man who kills a banker with an instrument is not moved merely by blood. He is moved by paper. The papers will be in motion at the bank by morning. I prefer to stand by the machine before it starts." The cab rattled eastward through sleeping streets. In the gray of the early hours, London wears a different face, less boastful, more squalid, the grand facades reduced to damp stone and the poor made poorer by the cold. Holmes sat forward, chinned upon his hand, and I saw that his mind was turning the last encounter over and over, not in frustration, but in that peculiar manner by which he squeezed a fact until it yielded its hidden juice. "He said," I murmured. Recalling the whisper by the rope, "You read the method. But you did not read the man." Holmes' eyes opened. "Yes, that was vanity. And vanity," he added, "is always an opening." We drew up at last before the dark bulk of Willoughby and Sloane. The place was shuttered, but a night watchman admitted Lestrade upon the strength of his authority, and Holmes upon the strength of his name. The corridors within smelled of ink, leather, and the dust of money long counted. We were shown into a private room where ledgers lay stacked like tombstones and the gas burned low. A man awaited us there, thin, nervous fellow with a clerk's stoop and a clerk's pallor. His hair was carefully parted, his cuffs immaculate. But his eyes had that restless watchfulness which comes of long hours and secret fears. "Mortimer Vane," Lestrade said curtly. "You know why we're here?" Vane swallowed. I have been at my lodging, Inspector. I have nothing to do with Mr. Willoughby's death." Holmes moved around him, not like a bully, but like a physician examining a patient. "Your hands are ink-stained," said he. "You have been writing." I could not sleep. "Because you feared arrest," Lestrade growled. "Because I feared ruin," Vane snapped, and then seemed instantly to regret the heat in his voice. "You do not understand. Mr. Willoughby held men's lives in his pen." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "In his pen and in his seal. Tell me, Mr. Vane, does the bank possess a seal with black wax?" Vane blinked. "Black wax. We use red for most correspondence." "And for certain correspondence." Holmes persisted. Vane hesitated. "There is. A private stamp used by Mr. Willoughby for matters he did not wish to pass through ordinary channels. It was kept in his desk here, not at his house." Holmes leaned forward. "Describe it." "A small metal die," Vane said reluctantly, "with an W and an N anchor. It was his mark for certain accounts." Lestrade stared. "Anchor? What accounts?" Vane's face tightened. "Accounts which did not exist officially." Holmes' voice was very soft. "Ah, in that single syllable I heard the snap of a trap, closing not on Vane, but on a far larger creature. Holmes turned to the ledgers and ran his finger down a page with practiced ease. "Watson, do you see the pattern? These entries too neat, too regular. A man hiding a sin often keeps his hiding place immaculate." Lestrade planted his fists on the table. "Are you saying Willoughby was crooked?" "I am saying," Holmes replied, "that Willoughby had secrets valuable enough to kill for, and that he was the sort of man who would laugh at a threat because he believed himself untouchable." Vane's breathing quickened. "If you expose this, you will destroy the bank. You will destroy me." Holmes looked at him with a sudden, startling compassion. "No, Mr. Vane. The man who wrote with black wax has already begun that destruction. I'm merely preventing him from choosing the victims." He drew out the brass-handled spring spike, wrapped in his handkerchief, and placed it upon the table. Vane recoiled as if it were a snake. "You recognize it?" Holmes said quietly. Vane's eyes flicked away. "No." Holmes' tone hardened. "Look at it. It is not a street weapon. It is a craftsman's piece commissioned, designed, paid for. And the hand that held it tonight was the hand of a man who has signed documents and shaken hands in decent rooms." Lestrade's face worked. "Who, then?" Holmes did not answer at once. He opened a drawer in Willoughby's private desk, and from within he produced a small 10 empty, now save for a smear of black residue. He held it up to the lamplight. "This," said he, "matches Pike's tin precisely. Our murderer provided his own wax, not because wax is hard to find, but because he wished the black seal to be his signature. He is not content to kill. He must be recognized." Vane's voice came out in a whisper. "There is only one man in the bank who uses that anchor freely, one who insisted upon it. Mr. Willoughby's silent partner." Holmes' eyes met mine. "At last," said he. "The man behind the curtain." Lestrade leaned in, breath harsh. "Name him?" Holmes slipped the tin back into the drawer and closed it with a decisive click. "Not yet, Inspector. A name without proof is a cudgel for the foolish. We shall have proof by dawn, and then you may have your arrest." And as he spoke, I understood the shape of his plan. Not to chase a phantom through fog, but to force a respectable man into the full glare of daylight, where neither mustache nor limp nor black wax could protect him any longer. Dawn had not yet broken when Holmes brought us out into Lombard Street. The fog here was thinner, for the river's breath moved through the alleys like a living thing, but the stones shone wetly under the lamps, and every iron railing seemed to sweat. Holmes walked with his head slightly bent, as though the very paving stones might betray secrets, while Lestrade kept close. His impatience now sharpened into a fierce anticipation. "You said proof by dawn," the inspector muttered. "If you're wrong, you'll have made a fool of me in front of my own men." Holmes glanced at him with faint amusement. "My dear Lestrade, you have survived worse injuries to your dignity." He turned into a narrow passage between warehouses and stopped before a side entrance to the bank one used. Vane had told us, by partners who preferred not to be seen by clerks and customers. A brass plate bore no name. Holmes touched it with his gloved fingers and nodded once, as if confirming what he had already inferred. "Here is the stage door," said he. A single constable waited in the shadow, placed there by Lestrade's order while we spoke with Vane. Holmes spoke to the man in a low tone, and the constable stepped back, indicating that no one had passed since he took his post. Holmes' eyes went to the lock, and for the first time that night I saw him hesitate, not from doubt, but from the delicacy of what he was about to do. "Watson," said he quietly, "if a man is to be dragged into the light, it is best that the light fall full upon him. When we open this door, the matter ceases to be a puzzle and becomes a human tragedy." Lestrade grunted. "Spare me." "Open it." Holmes did not use a key. Instead, he drew from his pocket the little brass cylinder Pike had carried the grooved. oiled pea sand, with it a second object, no larger than a postage stamp, a thin plate of metal with a notch cut like a smile. He set the plate against the lock, slid the brass piece into position, and applied pressure with a surgeon's calm. There was a soft click, and the door yielded. Lestrade stared. "You picked it." "I persuaded it," Holmes replied. "Locks are like men. They have weaknesses." Inside, the bank was a cavern of shadow. The high counters and glass partitions loomed in the darkness, and the air held that peculiar dry smell of paper that has been handled by generations. Holmes moved without sound, his hand raised for us to follow. He did not head for Willoughby's private desk. He went instead to a stair at the rear. "Up," he whispered. "He does not sleep among ledgers. He sleeps among assurances." We ascended to a small suite of rooms above the banking floor private. Richly furnished and, in the dimness, oddly oppressive. A fire had been laid but not lit. A decanter stood upon a sideboard like a captured jewel. The curtains were drawn, and the whole place had the air of a man's refuge. One who could afford to hide from the very city that made him rich. Holmes paused outside the inner door and listened. We heard faintly the rustle of cloth, the soft clink of glass. Someone was awake. Holmes turned to Lestrade and spoke so low that I scarcely caught it. "When I open that door, do not charge like a bull. Let him speak. Let him commit himself. Men of his kind prefer words to blows." Lestrade's hand tightened on his truncheon, but he nodded. Holmes rapped once firm, deliberate hand opened the door at the same instant, so that the occupant had no time to compose himself. The room within was lit by a single lamp. A man stood by a writing table, half turned, a glass in his hand. He was of middle years, well dressed even in his dressing gown, with a dark mustache and hair brushed carefully back. When he saw us, surprise flickered across his face, astonishingly amusement. "Mr. Holmes," said he, and his voice was smooth as oiled machinery. "You do not knock like other visitors." Holmes' eyes were cold. "You have made a habit of unusual entrances yourself, Mr. Adrian Sloane." At the name, Lestrade made a sound like an animal and took a step forward. The man's gaze flicked to him and back, dismissing the inspector as one dismisses furniture. "So," said Sloane softly. Vane talked. Holmes moved into the room. Vane did not need to talk. "You talk constantly. You talk in wax and brass, in rehearsed limps and borrowed scars. You talk with theatrical letters because you cannot endure that a deed be done without an audience." Sloane's smile tightened. "You have imagination." "I have evidence," Holmes replied. He crossed to the writing table. Upon it lay a stick of sealing wax black, can beside it, still warm, a metal die, a W entwined with an anchor. Holmes did not touch it. He merely pointed. "You will note, Lestrade, that the black wax is not in a clerk's drawer tonight. It is in the hand of a man who insists upon it." Holmes' gaze shifted to a small tin near the lamp. "And here is the second tin identical to Pike's, identical to the residue in Willoughby's desk. Only yours is full." Sloane's eyes narrowed. "You break into my rooms, and you point at stationery. Is this your great climax?" Holmes' voice sharpened. "Your climax failed in the Mews. You came yourself to collect Pike because you could not bear to leave the scene to another. When you leaped for the rope, you forgot the one thing a man never forgets when he truly limps pain. You ran like a sound man." Sloane's hand lowered slightly, and I saw the movement which betrayed him. His fingers, long and precise, drifted towards his pocket, towards that spring-driven spike which Holmes had taken from him in the yard. He remembered too late that it was gone. Holmes watched the gesture as a cat watches a mouse. "Willoughby," said Holmes, "kept a private seal for private accounts. Your accounts. You feared him not for his conscience, but for his amusement. He laughed at threats, you see. He laughed at you. And men like you can endure many things, but not laughter. Sloane's face, for the first time, lost its polish. You cannot prove I killed him. Holmes turned his head slightly. Watson. I understood then why he had insisted I come. From my pocketbook I drew, with a hand that trembled despite my resolve. The scrap Holmes had taken from my surgery wastebasket, the torn corner of cheap paper with its faint brown smear. Holmes held it up beside a pad upon Sloane's table. Cheap office paper, its corner torn. The knife planted on Dr. Watson, said Holmes, was wiped with paper torn from a pad of this sort. A banker might not keep such paper at home, but a man directing a scheme might keep it where he writes instructions to his tools. Lestrade gave a harsh laugh. And what about the device? The vent trick. Holmes' eyes went to the mantel. There, half hidden behind a clock, lay a narrow strip of spring steel. And beside it, a little brass housing unfinished, as if discarded in haste. Here is your workshop, Holmes said. You had Pike build the larger mechanism, but you refined the killing point yourself because you could not resist improving it. You broke the tip in Willoughby's body, and you feared the fragment would betray the construction. You threw it in the fire and trusted the ash to erase it. Yet fire does not erase steel. It only changes its color. Sloane's composure cracked. Willoughby would have ruined me, he hissed. He was going to turn. He enjoyed it. He dangled it like a sweet. Holmes' expression did not soften. And so you stabbed him through a ventilator like a rat in a wall. Then you planted a common knife on my friend for sport. You turned murder into correspondence. Sloane's eyes flashed, and for an instant I saw the pleasure Pike had described, the pleasure of making folk jump. And you, Mr. Holmes, said he softly, jumped. You came running. Holmes' reply was almost weary. I came because a man was dead. Your vanity is not as interesting as you believe. Lestrade stepped forward, and the constable at the door moved in. Adrian Sloane, Lestrade growled, I arrest you for the murder of Horace Willoughby. Sloane did not resist at first. He stood very straight, like a man posing for a portrait. Then, as the constable's hand touched his sleeve, he made a sudden, desperate lunge, not for the door, but for the lamp. He struck it from the table. The room plunged into darkness as glass shattered and oil hissed. Watson? Cried Holmes. I sprang forward, and in the blackness there was the sound of struggle. A choking gasp, and then a sharp, metallic click like a spring released. For one sick moment I thought Sloane had produced another spike and that someone had been stabbed unseen. Then Holmes' voice came, hard and controlled. Hold him. He has only his pride. The lamp was relit by trembling hands. Sloane lay pinned against the carpet, his face twisted with fury. Lestrade's men upon him. In his hand was not a weapon, but the anchor die, clenched like a talisman. He stared at Holmes with hatred that was almost worship. You'll write about it, he spat. Your doctor will. You'll make me famous. Holmes rose, straightening his cuffs with a fastidiousness that was like an insult. No, said he. Watson will write the truth, and the truth will make you smaller than you can bear. When it was over, and the dawn at last began to thin the fog beyond Lombard Street, we stood for a moment upon the bank steps. The city stirred, indifferent as ever, and a milk cart rattled past as though murder were no more than another item on the morning's ledger. Holmes drew a long breath and looked up at the paling sky. It is a curious thing, Watson, said he. How men will spend their genius, not in living, but in arranging how they will be remembered. And you? I asked. He gave that brief, self-macking smile. I spend mine in preventing them.